Hi, everybody. Welcome and thank you so much for joining us today to talk about Exiled to Motown, a community history of Japanese Americans in Michigan. My name is Celeste, and this is my curator, Mika Kennedy. And before we delve into talking about Exiled to Motown, we just wanted to introduce ourselves and give a bit more detail. So my name is Celeste. I use she and they pronouns. I'm currently based in Southeast Michigan. And I'm Yonsei, and aside from my Exiled to Motown duties, I am Operations and Program Associate at Rising Voices, which is a local nonprofit organization in Michigan that works to build power and develop leadership with Asian American women, femmes, queer people, and families. And I'll pass it over to you, Mika, to tell us a little bit more about you.
Hi, so I'm Mika, like Celeste said, and I am based right now in Southwest Michigan, and I go by she, her pronouns and am Yonsei, or fourth generation Japanese American. And unlike Celeste, who grew up in Michigan, I moved here in 2013, where I joined the JCL and have become the current president of the JCL Detroit chapter. And I'm also a visiting assistant professor in the English department at Kalamazoo College, where I teach Asian American literature, among other things. So super excited to say hello to everyone. So I guess I'll go ahead and start us off and say that this project actually kind of predates both my and Celeste's work on Exiled to Motown. And it began as a project of the JCL Detroit chapter and their history project committee, recording and putting together these oral histories that they conducted over the course of over a decade between 2003 and 2015. And they became this book called Exiled to Motown, which was published in 2015 or thereabouts.
2014, yeah, around there.
At which point then, the chapter really wanted to find different ways of sharing these stories and making sure that they could be heard and known by as many different people as possible. And that's sort of where kind of our part in the project came to be. And if you want to talk a little bit about the current iteration of Exiled to Motown as an exhibit, Celeste, I would be happy to give the floor to you.
For sure, thank you. So before Exiled to Motown was in its current iteration that it is now at the Detroit Historical Museum, it actually existed as a smaller traveling exhibit that visited a few local libraries in Michigan, and we also actually took it to the JCL National Convention in Salt Lake City, I think it was a couple of years ago now. So that was kind of like our smaller capsule version, and then we came to a point where, kind of in the original spirit of the project, we wanted to find a way for Exiled to Motown to be able to reach out and draw in community members and serve as a platform for people to tell their families' stories. And we also thought it would be an exciting opportunity and engaging to have people have a chance to lend their family heirlooms and objects to the exhibit to create a kind of multimodal experience. And we also, alongside having this kind of call for family objects and heirlooms, we're asking people to do very casual oral histories alongside the objects, kind of telling us a bit more about them and using the object as a starting point to tell us more about their family and their own story of being Japanese American in Michigan and kind of how their family came to be and their experiences of community, especially in the context of resettlement following the incarceration. So the exhibit is now currently at the Detroit Historical Museum. We were lucky to kind of co-produce it alongside of them. When we first started talking with them, we were able to show them like this was the exhibit as a in its traveling edition, and like what would it look like if we expanded content. Mika will probably get into this a bit later. Created this amazing, very expansive timeline that really roots the museum goers in Detroit and what it means to be in Detroit alongside other communities here. And so the exhibit will be up at the museum until October 3rd. And we hope that the Exiled to Motown will live on, beyond that physical space as a project, hopefully for years to come. And we're still kind of talking and brainstorming about the different iterations that it might take. So yeah, and then Mika, I think that I'll pass it back to you to tell us a bit more about where we're going.
Sounds like a plan. All right, so for this presentation in particular, we wanted to try and share a little bit about what that story looks like from the Exiled to Motown exhibit. Of course, in this kind of brief time, we won't have time to talk about every single story in the same way that the exhibit itself cannot encapsulate every experience that every Japanese American in Metro Detroit has kind of felt and has within their histories. But we wanted to try and give you a little bit of a sense of what that narrative is like, both in terms of kind of these broad historical strokes and how there came to be a Japanese American community in the Midwest, in Michigan, in Metro Detroit, to begin with, and then to move into some of the kind of very particular and intimate stories that kind of inhere in these objects that were lent and these kind of photographs and snapshots that comprise some of the kind of the material paper archive that the exhibit draws from. And moving from that, we then wanted to close by thinking about how so we living in Michigan, we Japanese Americans, we people kind of choosing to work and live and play in the United States or kind of existing in this space, can carry these histories within our present and into the future and begin and continue to cultivate kind of broader solidarities with all of these communities that we are a part of and interacting with. And so those are the three main pieces that we're hoping to cover in this presentation with you. So we'll go ahead and start off with a little bit of that kind of introductory history where we're thinking about how Japanese Americans ended up in this area, what drew them here, and in some cases, kind of essentially forced or exiled, one might say, Japanese Americans to this area.
So just to give a little bit of historical context, when we think about the stories of Japanese American communities in the Midwest, we generally tend to begin with resettlement following the incarceration. So Mika, I'm wondering if you can share a bit more with the group. What brought Japanese immigrants to Detroit pre-World War II, pre-resettlement?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important question, right? Because those of us living in Michigan, it feels kind of like this foregone idea. Like, of course, there's Japanese Americans here. We live here. But at the same time, I think it's something that a lot of people don't really kind of conceptualize. And it's like, oh, there are Asians in Michigan, even just generally speaking. And so it becomes a really interesting part of this history in particular, because I feel like if there is something that people know about kind of Japanese American history, it is, of course, the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. And that can often feel like a very kind of West Coast kind of history, because that's where the exclusion zone was. That is where people were forcibly removed from their homes, and the camps were all located technically in the West, often in kind of the traditional West, where we're thinking about like Colorado and Utah and Wyoming and Arizona and California, as well, and Idaho, Idaho, as well as Arkansas. But it becomes, I think, a story that's really important also to the Midwest when we think about what came after. Like, what came after for Japanese American history, World War II. It didn't end in 1945. And there was this process of resettlement where people were either returning to the West Coast, or if they felt there was nothing remaining for them there or needed to make a new start elsewhere, coming also to different areas like the East Coast and the Midwest. And I think the part of this history that really stands out to me the most is that this process of resettlement did not start when the war ended. And it actually started before. It started, in fact, almost immediately after people began arriving in the camps at all in 1943. And in 1943, there were some invitations for students to kind of continue their education in colleges in the Midwest or outside at least the West Coast. And then thereafter, kind of ways to apply to leave the camps in order to take employment outside of the Western exclusion zone. And these dates really stand out to me because you think about incarceration, and it is this massive undertaking on behalf of the federal government on the basis that there is some suspicion that Japanese Americans might be these enemy aliens who are dangerous to national security. And at the same time, then you have this immediate turnaround where there's this process of potential resettlement and you can leave the camps. And in some ways that might feel like a charitable gift, right, on behalf of the federal government. And we're like, oh, you don't have to stay in these incarceration camps. You can go elsewhere and kind of start a new life. But I don't think that's the right tack to take at all, right? Because there was kind of irrevocably this forcible removal from the West Coast. And there were far too many kind of qualifications and strings and machinations that are kind of underpinning this resettlement project on behalf of the federal government to be able to look at it in those terms. And I say this because the process of resettlement was not intended as some kind of gift. It was an attempt on behalf of the United States to assimilate the threat and to break up Japanese American communities that had formed on the West Coast by allowing people to move sort of piecemeal into areas with really low Asian populations in hopes that they would not be able to form, for instance, Japantowns or to continue those community ties, and that the idea of a Japanese American community or a Japanese American would kind of slowly dissolve into the fabric of the Midwest, which here is kind of translated to white America. And so when we think about resettlement and think about resettlement in the West from the perspective of the US government, it was about this assimilation and this erasure of community as a result of assimilation and dispersal. And I think what becomes really important about that story is that it didn't come to pass, right? There is a Japanese American community in multiple places in the Midwest, even if it is small, even if people might not know that history, those things persisted. And so I wanted to give a little bit of kind of flavor as to what that initial resettlement looked like, because even as the federal government was saying like, oh yes, you can apply to leave these camps and you can further your education, you can find jobs, there was not on the ground a whole lot of federal support for this. So in order to leave the camps, you would need to write letters to prospective employers or universities and have them accept you if you would be allowed leave. And you couldn't just write anywhere, right? So one of the people who ended up in Michigan is named Walter Meow, and he was talking about this process of writing these letters. And he said that some of his siblings had applied in Chicago and then left for Chicago, but Chicago hadn't answered his inquiries in particular. And he ended up getting a response from Detroit. So he went to Detroit. And so this family is ending up in multiple places at the same time. And once he arrived in Detroit, he then had to figure out how he was going to find housing, where he was going to find a job. And these things did not kind of magically materialize or were not provided by the War Relocation Authority. And so the process of resettlement as it bore out was a lot more difficult and a lot less kind of shiny and gift-like than one might expect from this idea that you could resettle and leave the camps and have that be this sort of, again, this gift. And so the question then becomes, right, like, all right, if there is not this infrastructure, if there is not support for this thing, and you as a kind of someone coming out of an incarceration camp where you've lost everything, um, who where is that help? Where is kind of that support? And in Metro Detroit, the Society of Friends, or the Quakers, provided a lot of that assistance, as well as Japanese Americans who were already living in the area. And so for the bulk of people coming to Metro Detroit did come after the war ended. And so there were kind of waves of people who had come before that were then turning around to help kind of recent people relocating to the Metro Detroit area. But there were also, and I think this is important to note, that there were also people of Japanese descent who were already living in Michigan prior to World War II, prior to resettlement. And that becomes an important part of this story because I think it begins broadening out this idea of what this community looks like and what the multiple kind of ways people found themselves coming here were. And the story that kind of is really near and dear to my heart as a reader and as a listener of the Exiled to Motown project is actually about Celeste's family and Celeste's great-grandfather. So Celeste, if you wanted to tell us a little bit about this story.
Sure. Thank you, Mika. And thank you so much for laying that groundwork about resettlement and how we really can't talk about Japanese American history in the Midwest and Michigan without bringing in resettlement. So I really appreciate that. So a story that I always heard in my family that I actually thought was a tall tale for the longest time, like when I was little, that I came to realize very quickly was actually true once we were working on the Exiled to Motown project, is the story of how my great-grandfather arrived in the United States and eventually Michigan, as he came up actually by way of Pennsylvania. So my great-grandfather's name was James Tadai Shimura. He came from Tokushima, Japan. It's said that he came from a pretty like working class, poor family and background. And when he came over in the early 1900s, was like loosely interested in automotive industry work. And so he started in Pennsylvania and quickly heard, I don't know, like by word of mouth, I believe it was his boss, he was working like a small auto factory, and he heard about Ford from his boss, who then like eventually like encouraged him to move to Detroit if he wanted to seriously pursue this. And the story goes that apparently his boss had like a stack of letters. One of them was addressed to Henry Ford himself, and he asked my grandfather to, as a duty or a favor, to mail these letters. And as my great grandfather did so, he like apparently memorized Henry Ford's home address, and then eventually himself decided to move to Detroit to try to make it in the auto industry there. And so the story goes that when he arrived in Detroit and was kind of getting himself set up, he was on a streetcar and passed by the Boston Edison district and like remembered Henry Ford's address. And so he hopped off and just decided to try to find Henry Ford's house. And apparently he was successful, and he walked right up to the front door, knocked on the door, and Henry Ford's wife answered, and my great grandfather asked for a job. And we believe that he was a very good talker. So, he may have embellished his background a little bit in terms of his expertise and his skills. And somehow that worked. And he ended up working, I believe, in as like a chemist in that realm for Ford, and eventually went on to work on like the rubber materials, and like has a lot of other very interesting stories about like where this career carried him. So that's kind of like the tall tale that ended up being true. And we'll show it in a bit, but there's a photo of my great grandfather standing in front of Henry Ford's house that was taken years later to kind of be paired with this story. But another thing that I wanted to mention about James Tadai Shimoda is kind of going back to what Mika was saying before about Japanese American resettlement in Michigan and people having to rely on the community that was not supposed to exist in order to actually find a way to survive. And so, a legacy that I tried to uplift and also live up to from my great grandparents was the way that they assisted Japanese Americans arriving from the West Coast after the war, and the ways that they tried to help people find housing, find secure jobs, and find resources. And I think, in the larger spirit of the things we're discussing and thinking about in Tadaima, like when we talk about abolition or when we talk about building structures and systems and interconnectedness and relationships that we need to survive, that's something that I'm thinking about, is like, where can we look back in our histories to moments that we as Japanese Americans were already doing this in our community, where we didn't rely on the state. So I find looking back at our own family history is useful for that as well.
Thanks so much for telling that story, Celeste. There's just something really deeply cinematic about it, but I think I really love the way that you tell it, because I think it's really easy for it to kind of feel like some kind of like pull yourself up by your bootstraps immigrant story, right? Where like you are doing all of these things by yourself and making your life. But it's never really that, right? It's always about kind of being able to be supported and then return support to communities that are around you, or communities that come after you or before you, and really kind of seeking to make those connections. That really segues well into being able to bring up a few of the many stories that then make up this community, that are so different from each other, but also very much a part of kind of the same tapestry. And so at the beginning of this presentation, Celeste mentioned that we had reached out to community members who were interested in volunteering some of their personal items and the stories behind them. So what we'd really like to do now is to be able to share with you a few of those objects and the stories that they hold within them.
So to give a little bit of a sampling of what viewers see in the Exiled to Motown exhibit, specifically the objects, we just wanted to share a few photos and descriptions about just a small fraction, again, some of the family heirlooms from our community that we are highlighting in the exhibit. So the first one that we thought would be exciting to share is this passport and record of moving that once belonged to Shizu Yokohashi Mano, who is the grandmother of one of our friends in the JSL Detroit chapter, Anne O'Neill. And Anne was kind enough to lend this, along with quite a few other family heirlooms, to the exhibit. And this passport and record of moving that Shizu wrote out herself, we believe dates to approximately 1930, possibly earlier. And you can see it's just like, it's pretty small, standard passport size in a leather case. I believe many of Shizu's documents were like folded up and stored inside, like important documents. But one of the most compelling parts, I would say possibly even more so than the passport, is this record of moving that Shizu wrote out herself. And if you look closely, you can actually see that it starts with the event of the incarceration. So, it begins with the family's move to Tule Lake, and then Shizu records every single move until the point that they're living in Birmingham, Michigan, which is a northern suburb of Detroit. And so Anne received this passport from her mother, Mio, and when I asked her, what is the story behind this? Why do you think this was kept in your family? Anne told me, I don't know why grandma kept them. I know that because they were in the camps and my dad was a child of the Depression, they were real keepers. They kept everything. I think grandma kept her passports and one of these booklets. She has all the places she lived after leaving California and going to the camps, because I think she felt she had to have some documentation. And to me, that quote from Anne is very poignant and really telling for some of the ideas we're exploring in the Exiled to Motown project, because it really touches on this question of what it means to reclaim history for ourselves and to be the keepers of our own memory and history. And I feel like a lot of that is just encapsulated in this object. And we could dwell on the upheaval that being sent to camp was, but I think of this record as She's way of really keeping and writing her own history and maintaining a form of agency in doing so. So there's a very significant reason that it starts with the move to Tule Lake, and then shows the family getting sent to the second camp to Minidoka, and eventually then Detroit, and then ending up in Birmingham, Michigan. And to move forward a little bit in time, just to another object that we have that is of a very different nature, we wanted to share this, which is the typewriter that was used again at here comes my great grandfather at the Oriental Provisions Company, which was an Asian restaurant supply store that he owned. And so this typewriter is being lent by the Shimura family, and it is dated approximately in the 1920s, possibly early 1930s. And it did first belong to my great grandfather, Tadai Shimura, who used it at the Oriental Provision Company, which was once located on Woodrow Wilson Street in Detroit. And my great grandfather ran the company with his eldest son, my great uncle, James Shimura. And they generally used this typewriter to create invoices. And according to my aunt and uncle, their father used to grow mung beans in very large vats to supply restaurants throughout central and south Michigan and also northern Ohio. And my family, again, like I don't think this is necessarily a tall tale, but something that I often heard was that Oriental Provisions Company was, among the first, possibly the first Japanese-owned business in Michigan. So that gives a bit of a sense of, it wasn't, all of our objects are not just focused on the camps. We certainly have some, or about movement, but some of them are really showing you the ordinary day-to-day life lives that Japanese Americans were living and working in here. And so Mika, I'll pass it to you to kind of give us a little bit more of a sampling and a little bit more of a taste of some of the community activities that Japanese Americans were engaging in.
Yeah. And so kind of going off of what Celeste was just talking about in kind of thinking about the different phases of what it means to have or to be within a Japanese American community in Detroit, one of the things that was really important to us was being able to recognize that we can't tell every story, but to also try to tell as many of them as we can. And so in creating this exhibit and thinking about ways we might be able to do that, I think one of the things that was really important to us was to show the number of ways, or to show the infinite variety that is possible, or the ways that it is possible to be Japanese American and be a part of a Japanese American community, even in just one city or one metro area. And I think that this becomes a really important piece of it, because if we're thinking about this resettlement as this process of, or this continuing process of assimilation and erasure through assimilation, then to have that many stories and that many different ways of bringing that kind of history and that identity with you is to fly in the face of an assimilatory narrative, or to fly in the face of something that is becoming homogenous. And so one of the things that Celeste really put together for this exhibit is kind of what I'm going to show you right here is a photo of this living room display of a lot of the different objects that community members lent to us for this exhibit. And it's a very full living room, not gonna lie, but I think that really speaks to it, right? Because it's not supposed to be emblematic of just one living room. It's this idea that there are many living rooms that are kind of existing in this space at the same time. And one of the things that I wanted to draw attention to today in this space is the ikebana on either side of the butsudan in the middle of the photograph. And ikebana is the traditional Japanese art of flower arranging. And these were done by Mio, who was the person that Celeste was just talking about in kind of keeping this record of her moving and ending up in the city of Detroit. And I wanted to draw attention to these because, again, I feel like they fly in the face of this assimilation narrative, where there can be people who are of Japanese descent and continuing this traditional Japanese art, even though they were given explicit directions by the government to leave that behind and to not be thinking in that way or kind of continuing in these arts. And we see this a lot, even kind of as the decades pass. So if we're thinking about the span of history between resettlement and now, we're attempting to cover here like the 40s and the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s and the 2010s and now the 2020s. And so there's any number of ways that this kind of comes to fruition. And I wanted to show another photograph of ways that not only was it something kind of being practiced individually or within the Japanese community, American community, was also pieces of this culture being shared with the broader Detroit community. And so Detroit had these festivals called the Far Eastern Festivals in the 70s and 80s, where a number of different communities would showcase and share dances and music and food. And one of the things that the Japanese American community in Metro Detroit shared was traditional Japanese dance. And so this is a photograph of a young woman named Linda Fukuda, who was kind of someone who was growing up in the Metro Detroit area in the 70s and 80s as a young person in the 70s and 80s and still carrying these traditions with her. When your history is to have been scapegoated by your government on the basis of your race and your background and your kind of cultural lineage, and then to kind of continue carrying that forward, even though it's something that had been used to do you harm in the past, I feel like is really important. But equally important are these next couple of photographs that I wanted to show you. And these are snapshots from the archives of the Motor City Golf Club, and kind of these Japanese Americans who were kind of intentionally making the choice to congregate with each other and play golf with each other. And this, I think, is equally as important as kind of carrying these traditional Japanese cultural art forms, even though you might look at a golf game and be like, well, how important is that? Like, people play golf, all right. But I think it really is important, right? Because you can look at these photos and you can think about kind of the pleasure that you see in their faces for these snapshots and the kind of importance of continuing to take pleasure in each other's company. And I think even though it's these small moments and these moments that maybe in the span of history might come across as frivolous, they're actually really important and just integral to what makes a community in the first place, what makes this community in Metro Detroit, particularly because these photographs, they're from 1954. So that's less than a decade after the end of World War II. And to be able to kind of have that moment feels really important. And to have that moment, particularly for something that doesn't necessarily on its face feel like traditionally or maybe quintessentially Japanese, be a quintessential part of the Japanese American community in Metro Detroit, and to be part of that history and that memory. And that, I feel like, really speaks to what to me, as someone coming from California and becoming part of this community, having now moved to Michigan, kind of really stands out. Because as I was going through the archives and looking at kind of all these photographs and thinking about the stories that we might be able to tell with them, something that really kind of stood out to me as someone who is by nature a car enthusiast, but also someone living at the time in Southeast Michigan, where the big three in the automotive industry is so much a part of the cultural landscape of the area, is that a lot of the photographs that we have in the JCL Detroit chapter archives are kind of snapshots of families in front of the family car. And that's not something that would have been kind of specific to Michigan in any way. But I feel like it is something that becomes an integral part of the story, because the car, by virtue of the Motor City and Ford and Chrysler and GM, is so much a part of what people think about when they think about Detroit, when they think about Michigan, and is so much a part of this American iconography. Like, what is more all-American than standing in front of this American-made car? But at the same time, it also, when the family standing in front of the car is Asian or is of Japanese descent, it feels like a way of claiming that lineage as one's own, claiming that iconography as one's own, be like, this is my family, this is our car, this is our home. And the way that you see the kind of the traditional standing in front of car taking family photo motif recur in this archive so many times, just is very visually powerful and visually arresting to me as a viewer and to some of the people that we've talked to. And I think that leads into them thinking about the relationship between Metro Detroit and the Japanese American community here and the automotive industry, because it's something that's been part of the story since the beginning, right? Where Celeste was talking about her great-grandfather and his coming to kind of assert his job at Ford. And as one of kind of the major employers in this area to this day, there are a lot of Japanese Americans who also ended up working at Ford's in various different capacities, one of whom is a JCL Detroit chapter member and kind of longtime flagship member of the Japanese American community here, Mary Kamidoi, who was incarcerated at Rower in Arkansas and then eventually came to Michigan with her family and ultimately found work at Ford. And when she was telling her story, it is something that begins to get at the difficulties around that, right? Where it's not necessarily the case where like Japanese Americans come to the Midwest and are kind of unilaterally welcomed with open arms. And so when she was talking about her time at Ford, she was also talking about someone who was a young woman working in a kind of male-dominated field, and being asked questions about like her origins, or talking about kind of this specter of an imperial Japan and being asked to account for that. And so that is also a part of what it means to be Japanese American, what it means to be Japanese American in Metro Detroit. And we really see that coming out even as we get further and further away historically from World War II in the 70s and 80s, when the Japanese automotive industry starts really kicking into high gear, and there's in the United States an economic recession and an oil crisis, and the economical size and of these Japanese vehicles is becoming increasingly appealing to United States buyers. And this is causing a lot of friction in the American automotive industry and is beginning to kind of cultivate this rise of anti-Japanese sentiment as a result of kind of this economic competition and recession. And this is important to kind of highlight in this section, or in thinking about what it means to be a part of this community and what these stories all pan out to, because this this feeling of anti-Japanese sentiment begins to snowball into kind of a generalized anti-Asian sentiment. In the next section, we're going to talk a little bit about the killing of Vincent Chin in 1982 in Highland Park, Michigan, and how the Asian community here responded to that, and in what ways we continue to carry that forward, and in what ways we can continue to build support across communities and build solidarity with one another.
So we wanted to round out this conversation by discussing the need for broader solidarities that exploring these histories really places upon us as Japanese Americans living in the year 2021. And in the exhibit, we attempt to illustrate this in our final section that the museum goer kind of ends up at after walking through various sections, where we invite people to respond to this question that we have displayed in vinyl letters on the wall, asking, what does solidarity look like to you? And then we invite museum goers to write their response on a sticky note, put it up on the wall. And I think, this is still the conversation, but possibly in a future phase of Exiled to Motown, we'll be compiling these responses and really weaving them into their own part of the story, as a way to keep this alive and not just something that we're seeing as like solidarity in the past, or as something that is separate from the exhibit in any way. We also provide origami paper and instructions, and invite museum goers to fold suru, or cranes, that we eventually will be sending to Suru for Solidarity, which, if you haven't already heard about it, through Tadaima is a national movement of Japanese Americans who are really standing on the moral authority of our experience during the incarceration, and are organizing today to end detention and also support reparations for Black Americans. So, before we talk a little bit more about ways that we're highlighting broader solidarities physically in the exhibit, Mika, do you want to share a bit about historically what we're looking at in terms of Pan-Asian organizing and what that grew out of in Michigan?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mentioned at the end of our last section that we were sort of coming to this moment of increasing anti-Japanese sentiment in the wake of economic recession and kind of the rise of the Japanese automotive industry in competition with the American automotive industry. And I mentioned the name Vincent Chin. And Vincent Chin is someone whose kind of history, story, and legacy is kind of critical to understanding Asian America in the Metro Detroit area and far beyond it. So you may have noticed that Chin is not a Japanese surname, and Vincent Chin, in fact, was a young Chinese American who was working as a draftsman and living in Metro Detroit. And in June 1982, he was at his bachelor's party and got into an altercation with two white men who would later find him outside and chase him down and beat him ultimately to death in Highland Park, Michigan, which is a suburb of Detroit and is one of the spaces in the 1940s where Japanese Americans were most prominently kind of coming to and living in during the resettlement. And eyewitnesses to this beating and this murder overheard these men yell, "It's because of you we're out of work." And what that means, or what that implies, is that kind of Vincent Chin was to them the scapegoat for this larger kind of economic friction between the United States and Japan and these automotive industries. And what that kind of says to me is that they saw Vincent Chin, saw his Asianness, and associated that Asianness with the Japanese automotive industry and with Japan, with Japanese America, with Chinese America. And all of those distinctions and all those differences ceased to matter in that moment. And it became this idea that it's because of you, you individual Chinese American man in Highland Park, Michigan, that the automotive industry in the United States is in crisis. And in the wake of Vincent Chin's killing, and in the kind of context of this happening within this kind of specter of anti-Asian sentiment, the Asian American community in Metro Detroit kind of began to band together. And so I wanted to share a quote from Jim Shimura, who's a lawyer and a relative of Celeste and was a volunteer attorney for Vincent Chin's mother, and a founding member of an organization called American Citizens for Justice, which kind of took point in terms of trying to not only name the injustice of Chin's killing, but to find some way forward and to find some way to refuse to let that kind of die in darkness. And so Jim Shimura said that it was the first case in the modern era that really brought anti-Asian violence into the public consciousness. It helped build a national movement and coalition which encompassed not just Asian Pacific American groups, but also groups that were Black, Hispanic, Native American, people that were Jewish and Muslim, all kinds of organizations that were otherwise not in that type of network were beginning to coalesce behind this case. And I think that feeling is really important because it's one of these instances where there is this kind of pan-ethnic solidarity forming in the wake of incredible violence. And I think some of the reasons for that is kind of because in that moment it becomes clear that kind of under the heel of white supremacy, those distinctions don't matter. And in order to survive this, we need to be together. We need to support each other. And I think for the Japanese American community in Metro Detroit, this was especially salient because Vincent Chin had been mistaken or just sort of scapegoated as someone who could stand in for this kind of Japanese lineage. And so it became part of the history of Japanese America, even if the initial moment the actors were not Japanese American. And I think when we think about kind of that trajectory and those realizations, what really feels most important to me is this idea that in fact nothing is alien because we are all interconnected and need to really lean into those connections and to continue to build those connections because they can be a matter of life and death. And this is a really short introduction to kind of all of the details of the Vincent Chin murder and the Vincent Chin case. And we don't really have time to get into all of those, but I do think it's important if you're not familiar with this history to really kind of look at it. And so there is a documentary called Who Killed Vincent Chin, which is directed by Christine Choi and produced by Renee Tajima Pena. It was made in 1987. That's a really great starting point and that we include an excerpt of in the exhibit. And if you're looking for reading material, anything by Helen Zia is a really good place to start as well. Helen Zia is a journalist who was kind of at the forefront of the press around the Vincent Chin case in the 80s and kind of has continued to be one of the people really kind of speaking to in order to ensure that this story is not forgotten and continues to be contextualized because I think speaking from a place in 2021, that story feels altogether too present. And we're sitting here again in 2021, the end of 2021, looking out towards the 40th anniversary of Vincent Chin's death, which is coming in next June. And it still feels like something that could happen tomorrow, that continues to happen to people. And So what I'd like to do is kind of ask Celeste to really bring us home and to think about, now that we're living in this moment and we have kind of this history that we're holding within us and between us, where do we go from here? What does this look like in our present? What can we make it in our future?
Oh, yeah, thank you, Mika. That was a great way of like laying the groundwork of, I think, kind of where we want to turn this conversation. And I actually think it could be really interesting to explore, like in the Q&A at this moment. Of course, we can go over questions that are specifically about the exhibit and the histories and the objects, and like different history specific to Detroit. But I would also be really interested in seeing how we can generate conversation about what it means to be exploring our own histories as a way of healing, but then also of coming to this place where we're politicizing our identities as Japanese Americans. And with this history in mind, like with the history of the murder of Vincent Chin and what that meant, like as Mika was just discussing, and also as we brought up earlier with what Voodoo for Solidarity is standing for in terms of seeing the links, quite literally the links between Japanese American incarceration and immigrant detention today, and also, fight for redress, fight for reparations, and where we can come to a place where we have politicized our identities and memories as Japanese Americans so that we are standing in solidarity with BIPOC communities today. So I think, maybe we can start there as a place of conversation, and also, of course, be open to questions about the exhibit physically, and we'll certainly share photos of a bit of what it looks like to be in the exhibit. But I think we'd really love to hear from others too about what they're taking from learning about these histories, and then what it means for us moving forward.
Thanks, Celeste, so much for that. And thank you to everyone who's here and listening and sort of taking this time to be in community with us. And we look forward to continuing this conversation with you in the Q&A.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much to everybody tuning in. We really appreciate you taking the time to learn a bit about Japanese American history in the Midwest, and in particular in Detroit and Southeast Michigan. And we'd love to just kind of talk through some of the things that you thought about while you were listening to us speak. I'm seeing a question here. Ken Mochizuki, are there unique characteristics to Jays in the Midwest? For example, Japanese Americans in LA can be tougher and more tough and blunt than Japanese Americans in the Pacific Northwest. That is a really interesting question. I can go first, and then Mika, I don't know, you might have a good perspective for this question because you grew up in California and now have spent a significant amount of time in the Midwest. From my perspective, my partner is a Japanese American person who grew up in California, so I do feel like I get a bit of that experience. I don't know if I would say like as a unique characteristic, but something that we've looked at through the exhibit is this kind of resettlement narrative of like you come to the Midwest and maybe try to keep your head down. So I think this is not a personality trait, but I do think that there can be, for a lot of Japanese Americans, but maybe particularly in Michigan, this feeling of imposter syndrome, or wanting to connect with your culture and your history, but not really knowing if you have a place to do so because you don't feel like that's expected of you. There's still this idea that it's like a random place to be, to not be, Japanese American in California. So I think I came up against that a little bit in talking to community members and saying, like, we really think that these objects, belong in a museum, and these stories deserve to be told. And there was a bit of a, kind of like they didn't believe me a bit. But what do you think, Mika?
Yeah, I do think that's an interesting question because, like, my automatic response is to think that there's probably more differences between individuals living in a specific place than there are across these regions. But I think back to being someone who grew up in the Bay Area and then went to school in Southern California, and thinking about kind of the differences that I felt in kind of Asian American community in both of these areas. And I think the difference between what I had experienced in the Bay Area and what I experienced in San Diego was actually starker than the difference that I felt coming to Michigan, which might seem a little bit counterintuitive, but I think really the difference was probably not with the spaces, but with kind of my orientation to the communities that I was a part of. Because I don't feel like I really started identifying with Japanese American community until I was in college, growing up somewhere not with a dearth of an Asian population, but with an Asian population that was the majority, but was very pan-ethnic in that sense. So being part of something specifically JA was not something that I felt growing up. And so when we think about kind of what these sort of regional kind of archetypes might be for Japanese Americans in different areas, I think the thing that I have noticed most about Asian Americans kind of broadly writ in Michigan is that the distinctions between kind of what it means to be in Michigan as a Korean American, what it means to be in Michigan as a Japanese American or a Chinese American or someone who is South Asian American, feel a little bit more preserved, more kind of attuned to, in that there are these kind of very distinct histories that people are either kind of living or are trying to kind of recover and hear about in terms of kind of the family and the community that they're seeking out. Whereas like in the Bay Area, it was like, we're all Asian. And it was not necessarily super interrogated beyond that when I was growing up and in my experience growing up.
And then Mika, I don't know if you saw this, but we got a comment from David Fujioka, who Peter and Doris Fujioka are their uncle and aunt. So thank you so much for watching, David. That's really exciting to hear. I would be curious to know, if you have a connection to Michigan or to Detroit, and if you ever heard any of these stories from your aunt and uncle.
Yeah. Sorry.
Go ahead.
For those in the audience who are not familiar with the Fujiokas and their relationship to Detroit, Doris and Peter Fujioka were the founders of the Japanese American Citizens League Detroit chapter, and were a family that came to the area out of the camps and played a huge role in kind of fostering Japanese American community, helping people find housing, find jobs, find connection with each other.
I'm seeing another question from Ken. How well is Japanese/Asian American history taught in the Midwest compared to other areas of the country? I can only speak to my own education. I grew up in Michigan. I'm in Michigan right now, and I went through public schooling. I went to the University of Michigan, and I think something that this project has really thrown in my face is that I have everything I've ever learned about Asian American history, and especially Japanese American history, has been outside of educational institutions. So I've had to do it on my own. I've had to do I have the pleasure of doing it through community work like this, but it has taken for me and for my family and my cousins that effort of really having to be persistent, and in a way that's very frustrating and hurtful, but in another way I think it can be really empowering, because we have a good reason to not trust in institutions and taking them at their word. So I also think that it has shown me the value of oral history and other ways of learning about like Asian American studies or Japanese American history, and that not necessarily taking a very Western or not having to prioritize the written word, asking your family members what their experiences were. That can be just as valid of a way of learning about it. But I would be curious to hear, Mika, your response, because you are heavily involved in education and especially Asian American and Japanese American studies here in the Midwest.
Yeah, I was thinking about this question and wishing that I had a better sense of kind of the degree to which it is in fact covered in other areas of the country. And hopefully things will begin to shift and there will be more of an Asian American studies kind of curriculum at the K-12 level, at the undergraduate level and beyond. And I know Chicago is in the middle of really kind of trying to pass legislation that will make that happen. But honestly speaking, as someone who grew up in the Bay Area in an Asian majority city, we also did not have a whole lot of kind of Asian American or Japanese American education in my public schooling experience. It was still something that was largely based on kind of a self-education model. And when I ask my students, I'm a college professor currently based in Kalamazoo, which is in Western Michigan, and about halfway between Detroit and Chicago. And we have a lot of students who come from outside of the state of Michigan, but I always ask them, like, how familiar are you with kind of Japanese American incarceration history or the novels that we'll be reading? Have you heard of any of them? And far and away, the answer is generally that they have no knowledge, or that they know that it is a historical event that happened, but don't have any kind of additional knowledge beyond that. And there will be students who might have read something in a high school class at some point, or have some kind of additional thoughts because they have a Japanese American friend. But I think it is actually really telling that for the most part, all of them who are kind of coming to this liberal arts college and tend to be pretty invested in social justice, in literature and the arts and history, still don't necessarily have that education. And that's speaking now in 2021, where we've given presentations about Exiled to Motown for kind of senior citizen audiences in Metro Detroit. And some of the questions that came from them was like, this is a presentation about a time period where I was growing up. I was going to school in Detroit, and how come I didn't know that Japanese people even lived in the same city that I was living in? And the fact that that could be a question in the 50s and 60s and can continue to be, you know, not totally different even now that we have so much more kind of education initiatives, so much more work going into this, I think speaks to how far we have yet to go.
Thank you, Mika. And then we have another great question from David Fujioka. Were Japanese Americans welcome to Detroit following the closure of the camps, or was there some pushback to the influx of these outsiders? This is a question that we look at, I would say, in a few sections of the exhibit. And the first that come to my mind are like the sections where we're looking at what it meant to like make a home, to even be able to find a place to live, and then also finding employment and work. So I guess like off the top of my head, when I read this question, I think, you know, about the various stories of people who experienced housing discrimination, or who, you know, perhaps like in Mary Kamidoi's case, was told like, technically you could live here, but if something happens to you, like if you experience, you know, threats from your neighbors, or essentially like more overt violent racism, like there's not going to be anybody here to really stand up for you. Like nobody, essentially being given that message of no one will have your back. And I believe, was that in Dearborn, Michigan? So if you've been in Michigan, you know, Dearborn's a relatively large city. And then the other bit that comes to my mind, but Mika, I'll pass it to you for other good specific examples that address this, is that we have a section that looks at where Japanese Americans were working in Detroit and their experience there. And Mika put together a really thoughtful, like, kind of highlighting what was being covered in the news at that time, like what was actually being printed for people to read, coverage in terms of Nisei workers. And there's like this one article that mentions how Nisei women who are being hired as secretaries or typists are very diligent, very quick typists, as if this type, like as if it's a inherent racial quality. So, and then like, I believe this is in that same article, Mika, please correct me if I'm wrong. It also mentions Japanese American auto workers, but paints them in a light that says like, but they're not a threat to you. So we were talking about this the other day when we were looking about how the model minority myth is being crafted and drafted in various media outlets, but in this very tenuous way. So Mika, do you want to talk a bit more to this idea of welcome?
Yeah, and I think speaking historically, I think one of the things that has made Detroit kind of notorious is the degree to which its geography, its space has historically and structurally been one of really stark racial divide. So you can look at streets in Detroit and know that there is an area that is considered like the white area. There's areas that are considered the black area. And today we have kind of the sense of Detroit being a majority Black city and having its suburbs be very obviously white in kind of their majority population. So when we think about Japanese Americans coming into the same city, coming into this area, it begins to muddy the waters a little bit because it's very unclear for Japanese Americans on what side of that kind of racial divide they're going to fall on, and whether or not that decision is going to shift over time or shift perhaps very, very quickly. And so Japanese Americans coming into Detroit sometimes faced similar racial discrimination in terms of, like Celeste mentioned, in what areas of the city or what neighborhoods they would be allowed to live or to purchase a house. And yet at the same time, as Celeste mentioned in these newspaper articles, sometimes we're kind of talked up as being these neat and accurate secretaries, as being people holding professional jobs like doctors and nurses, and being talked up essentially as kind of the ideal newcomer to the city. And while that might feel like perhaps it was welcome, I think the important thing to really think about there is that there were caveats. It was a very conditional welcome, and there were motivations behind that level of welcome that were still rooted very much in racism and in pitting these Japanese American newcomers to the city against newcomers, for instance, who were coming up from the South who happened to be Black. And what really kind of bears this out is the fact that even though there was this kind of rhetorical welcome, there was this positioning of Japanese Americans as this kind of idealized newcomer, what they faced in their day-to-day in terms of housing discrimination, in terms of employment discrimination, was very much, in many cases, not one of kind of this universal welcome. And so I think that's really the piece that feels important to this story in terms of figuring out what the meaning of welcome even is, when kind of we hear these stories about the Midwest being a little bit more kind of open to the idea of Japanese Americans coming there versus the West Coast and returning to kind of the context of the Western exclusion zone during or after World War II, and having there be kind of a very immediate sense of vitriol in that context that maybe was not present in the Midwest in the same ways because the Asian population was significantly lower. But at the same time, it was not this kind of like flowers and daisies kind of experience for many, many families.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think we can't emphasize enough that, you know, to respond to what was, I'm sure, a rhetorical question from your part, Mika, like what constitutes a real welcome, we can say pretty confidently that does not constitute a real welcome because it hinges on cementing this anti-Blackness, you know, as much as possible. So like, you know, and this is something that I think if any of us dwell on, we can really get very angry about it, that really it may seem like almost innocent to highlight Nisei women and say they're really great typists, but to know that, as Mika was saying, the motivation behind that is to pit Japanese Americans against Black Americans coming up from the South after the second Great Migration. So especially, like, again, as Mika said, like, if you study the history of Detroit, you know just how segregated it really is. And a lot of the time people will talk about Detroit's history in terms of this Black-white narrative, but I think since we're talking about Japanese, how like our experiences as Japanese Americans fit in here in our history, like we can kind of see that being played out before our eyes, like how we're pitted against each other. And then continuing on, kind of what we were discussing towards the end of the presentation, we know that we weren't really welcomed here because the minute that the auto industry was suffering due to a larger force of capitalism and deindustrialization, Asian Americans were scapegoated, and it resulted in the murder of Vincent Chin. And that's really wasn't that long after folks were coming here for resettlement. But I really appreciate that question. Let's see. Oh, hello, Davis Nakashima.
Just in the audience.
We have some people saying hi. Also, hi from Doug. I have a question that I would just like to hear from you, Mika. Like, what has been one of the most enjoyable parts of the exhibit to work on for you, and seeing how the exhibit is in its iteration now? Like, what is one of your favorite parts?
I think my favorite part of the exhibit actually has nothing to do with the work that I did or the work that Celeste did, or even the work that any of the kind of oral historians and other record keepers of the Japanese American community did, but being able to kind of see all of the ideas that are coming out in that post-it wall that we showed a little bit earlier in the video, and to see what people are thinking about in terms of what solidarity looks like to them, and kind of looking at that range of answers, and also just viewers' willingness to participate in that way, because that was really one of our major goals in putting together this exhibit, is that it is something that would not just sort of be at the museum and then leave the museum, but to be something that people looking at it would then walk away from and ideally kind of weave into their thoughts, their daily lives, and kind of take that spirit with them. And so that's been really gratifying to see kind of the openness and enthusiasm with which people have embraced that invitation. And I know that might seem like kind of an ahistorical answer, but I feel like that's the goal of an exhibit like this, right? The goal is to be able to continue those stories and to be able to see that work kind of opening up as a horizon. So I have a feeling that I might have stolen Celeste's answer in terms of what really kind of is exciting, but before we get to the next question in the chat, I did want to ask Celeste a little bit about kind of the work that she's been doing with Rising Voices in terms of trying to cultivate that sense of community, and whether you think there's something kind of particularly Midwestern about what that looks like, or what that has looked like as you've been kind of engaged in various kinds of projects in Detroit.
Oh, thank you. That's a great question. So if, I don't know if anyone will have heard of Rising Voices, but we are a pretty amazing organization, if I do say so myself. We're a newer nonprofit in Michigan. We're a Pan-Asian American organization. And our main goal, generally speaking, is to build power and develop leadership with Asian American women, queer people, young people, and families. And as a part of Rising Voices, I joined in the past few months, kind of part operations, part organizing work. I've been trying to build a Suited for Solidarity chapter in Michigan alongside my good friend Luna Terauchi. And I think that, well, there's a few parts to your question, Mika, but what came to the top of my mind, and also kind of goes back to what you were just saying, is how the exhibit has been a great space, a great container to find people and to like catch people who have that intersecting interest of like, I'm Asian American in Michigan, I'm Japanese American in Michigan. I feel like sometimes I feel like I'm kind of out here on an island, but then also have this really vested interest in social justice. And so I think that something we do have in common is this kind of long winding journey of coming into our identities as Japanese Americans, but wanting to do so, as we discussed in the presentation earlier, in a really politicized way. So it's not just like, I'm Japanese American and like, I want to do, and I love mochizukis, but like, I'm in it for the mochizukis. Like, we're like, I'm Japanese American and I learned a little bit of our history. Like, I had to work hard to learn it. And when I did, I realized how messed up everything is. And I realized how connected I am to communities that are being most impacted by the carceral state today. And so I think maybe something that's unique to us as a group, as a Studio for Solidarity chapter that we're building in Michigan, is that a lot of us seem to have that that same legacy that I touched on earlier of like, I had to figure this out by myself, and it took me a really long time. But I think we are all also invested in seeing how we're connected to others in the area. And seeing how we can organize moving forward. Did I miss one of the questions, Mika?
No, I think that was a really kind of wonderful and layered response.
Yeah, well, I'm seeing some other questions too. This is Shinji Takahashi, LSA class of 87. Looking forward to your presentation. How has Michigan changed relative to the differences between Japanese expats versus Japanese Americans? And how has this nuance evolved over 40 years?
That is quite the question. And I think something that I look forward to delving into more as this project continues to evolve is really kind of including more of those histories of kind of Japanese nationals who are living and working in the Metro Detroit area. This is something that in the exhibit we tried to kind of push forward a little bit in terms of Celeste collecting some oral histories from Shinnikke. But it's really not something that is as present in the Exiled to Motown project as I know we both would really like. And I think part of that is because sometimes it can feel as though to be Japanese American requires some kind of personal root in the experience of incarceration, and to identify as Japanese American and you don't have that in your family's history can sometimes feel like you're overstepping in some way. And the ways that I've heard that from friends who are Shinnikke, in terms of these very different kind of histories of migration, these kind of different temporal trajectories of kind of being Japanese and living in the United States. But at the same time, I guess speaking kind of from my own personal perspective as someone whose ancestors were living in Hawaii as farmers and therefore were also not incarcerated during World War II, I think it really is a part of being Japanese American to kind of connect those different trajectories, to understand that kind of identity as being capacious enough to link the Shinnikke with who have kind of a more immediate connection often to Japan, with people who perhaps might have been in the United States for generations upon generations. And so when we think about kind of what that looks like in Michigan specifically, I think the thing that really stands out to me is that the Metro Detroit area has a relatively high Japanese population, as like this ethnic identity relative to other areas in Michigan, many areas in the Midwest. And it is actually still because of the automotive industry and the fact that there's a lot of Japanese automotive manufacturers who supply parts to the big three, but also Japanese automobile manufacturers who are also opening up offices here because it is still considered kind of a center of automotive kind of engineering and building in the United States. And so even again in 2021, we still have that connection through the automotive industry from which we began this history, thinking about kind of Tadai Shimura and forward back at the turn of the century, the 20th century, all the way through to World War II and kind of war industry, all the way through the 70s and 80s, and kind of the oil crisis and Japan bashing here in the United States.
Yeah, I would add to that, thinking from an organizing standpoint. I mean, my co-organizer of Tsudu, Michigan, that I mentioned earlier, she's Shin-Nikkei, so her parents came over in the 80s, and a lot of people that I'm happy to be getting in touch with now who are Japanese American living in Michigan. We have quite a good mix of people whose families have been here quite some time and those who have immigrated more recently. And I think that that's actually what gives us a lot of power, because we can see how the issues and the struggles that we're talking about affect us locally. And I think they are really invested in learning the history here, but also we see how this is a global struggle. And like these issues are not just going to be contained to us in Michigan, but we know that as Asian Americans, we have a really vested interest in looking at things on a global level as well. But yeah, I think just kind of a major through line through all of this is, and something that I've really loved about working on this exhibit is that it's been a great way to just meet people, because, you know, whether we are Yonsei, like me, or Shin-Nisei, or maybe Shin-Isei, like some of my friends I've met recently, we are all really like wondering, how can we find each other and how can we come together? So I think, you know, exhibits are one way of creating that space. I think there's other ways of creating kind of these third spaces that it can act as magnets for building community. And yeah, I'm just really, I think even Tadaima, like as a virtual platform, I don't know if others feel this way, but I feel like once you start getting involved in Japanese American community, you realize it's actually quite a small world, even if you're living, say, in Stockton or living in Detroit. Like at some point, there's a good chance that your worlds will collide. I did want to address one last question. Are any parts of this exhibit available for viewing online? We do have a website, but actually quite recently we have had the opportunity to do some filming in the exhibit. And so hopefully in the near future, in the next, I can't give a solid date, but I'm hoping that the next month or so, we will have a nice kind of filmed tour that includes some interviews, not only of Mika and I, but also from Laura Mizumi, who's the executive director of Rising Voices and is featured in the exhibit a bit at the end, to talk about community building. So we will certainly share that with the Tadaima folks, and it will be on our website, I believe. Any other resources that you have in mind, Mika?
I guess when we think about kind of the future of this project, there are multiple, but one of our ultimate goals is to be able to have a full online version of this exhibit that we can kind of continue to update as stories get shared and as more stories become part of this tapestry. And we're still in the very beginning stages of that kind of virtual exhibit, but we're really excited to be able to have gotten in touch with someone at Central Michigan University who is willing to help us out in being able to put together the first stages of kind of a 3D virtual exhibit version of Exiled to Motown. So not in the immediate future for that version, but certainly something that I'm looking forward to, and I hope that others will be able to take advantage of when for instance, you're not someone who's local to Metro Detroit, but is interested in learning these different kind of forms of Japanese American history, or someone who's not able to travel to Detroit in the middle of a global pandemic, for instance.
For sure. I know we're wrapping up, but I did feel like this comment, I'm not sure who this is from, deserves to be read because it kind of touches on a few things we were just saying. But they're saying, I grew up in Ann Arbor in the 70s and 80s and felt insulated from Detroit rage and Japan bashing, so had a much different experience. I would love to talk to you, whoever you are. I think that is so fascinating, and really, as we continue to find out how this project is going to live, experiences like this, I think could be really important to making sure that we're trying to tell as many, give as many perspectives as possible. So I appreciate you making that comment. And yeah.
We actually will have the opportunity to talk to him later this month.
Oh, great.
Yeah, so I can see his name, and that's Shinji Takahashi from the API alumni group.
Awesome. Well, that would be perfect. In that case, do we want to wrap up, Mika, or should we give space for a few more questions?
Let's see. Trying to see if we're missing anything, because we want to make sure that if you have a question to ask, that we're here to answer it. But
I am seeing, are there champions who arrange jobs for those in camps well documented? You mentioned the Fujiokas. My parents both left Minidoka for short-term work.
in terms of the archive that we have looked at, so looking at the JCL Detroit chapter archive, there's not a lot of materials from kind of the early 40s or the mid 40s or that early period. And we see a lot of the materials that have been preserved and that were kind of consciously set aside to be able to have that archive really coming out more so in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So as far as archives that we have been able to access to this point, we haven't heard a lot about what different groups were involved in arranging jobs. We know the story of the Fujiokas. We know that the Society of Friends or the Quakers was heavily involved, particularly in the Metro Detroit area, but also kind of broadly across the United States. We know that in addition to the Society of Friends, church groups were often kind of a part of that level of support, whether it be kind of the Christian church and the Buddhist churches that have eventually came to be in the Midwest.
Oh, I also want to give shout out to Haruka Sakaguchi, who said that this was affirming, as they are a Shin-Nikkei person, and that's thank you for writing that. Just want to say that's really great to hear, and I think that that's an exciting part of Tadaima, and also, you know, Tsuru for solidarity in general, is that we can all come together regardless of our generation, and I think there's a lot of power in that. I don't know if we have any other questions.
Other than that, thank you so much for such a vibrant discussion and all of your questions, allowing us to elaborate on some of the pieces of this history. And we look forward to being able to share them in various different forms. So thank you all so much for your time this wonderful Thursday. And thank you, Celeste, for being, as always, my favorite co-curator.
Oh, thank you, Mika, and thank you so much, everybody. And thanks to Kimiko and all those who are organizing Tadaima and all of this amazing programming. It feels really special to be able to be a part of it. So I hope everybody enjoys the rest of Tadaima.
Thank you.
Thank you.